The Boy Who Lost His Face by Louis Sachar. 4. Since the second grade, David had stopped by Scott's house every morning on the way to school. Scott's mother answered the door with a cup of coffee in one hand and half a croissant hanging from her mouth. She looked at David like she was surprised to see him. She pulled the croissant from her mouth. "Scott's already left, Davy," she said. "I assumed you were with him." David shrugged. "No big deal," he said. Then, "Oh, that's right," as if he suddenly remembered something. Scott had something he had to do this morning. Scott's mother had the coffee cup to her lips, and he walked away quickly before she had time to ask him anything more about what Scott had to do this morning. For some reason, he felt embarrassed in front of her that her son hadn't waited for him. "Bye, Davy," she called after him. He waved with his back to her. They had been Davy and Scotty until the 5th grade. Then they became Dave and Scott, but Scott's mother still called him Davy. He called her Sally. Once, when he was in the 3rd grade, they had spent half an hour crying in each other's arms after they had seen a dog get run over by a Jeep. It was kind of funny, he thought now as he walked away, that he called Scott's mother Sally, but Scott he called Simpson. When he got to school, he saw Scott and Randy standing on either side of the door of the boys' bathroom. He headed toward them, unsure if he was their friend, but they were right on the way to his locker, and he didn't think he should have to go out of the way just to avoid them. Besides, he had helped them steal the cane. That proved he was their friend. "Hi," he said. "Hi, Dave. How you doing?" asked Randy. "Ballinger," muttered Scott. "Simpson," said David. "So what was it that she said to you after you gave her the bird?" said Randy. "The bird?" asked David. "You know," said Randy. Then, smiling, he gave David the finger. David had never heard it called the bird before. "I don't know," he said. "She was just babbling. I mean, she could hardly talk with the lemonade coming out of her nose." He laughed. Neither Scott nor Randy laughed. "I don't know, man," said Randy. "It sounded like she put a curse on you." David smiled. "Yeah, right," he said. A boy with long, sloppy hair and blue sunglasses approached the bathroom door. Scott and Randy immediately blocked his path. "Bathroom's closed," said Scott. The boy stood there a moment. David recognized him from Spanish class. His name was Larry Clarksdale. He had only been at the school a few weeks. Larry chuckled as if it were some kind of joke. "Come on, let me through," he said. Scott and Randy didn't budge. "Can't you read the sign on the door?" asked Randy. There was no sign on the door. "It says closed for repairs," said Scott. Larry looked at David, or at least David thought he was looking at him. It was hard to tell where Larry was looking behind his blue sunglasses. David shrugged. Larry also shrugged and turned and walked away, slowly at first, then very quickly. Randy snickered. "Go use the girls' bathroom, pervert," Scott shouted after him. A minute later, Roger stepped out of the bathroom. He laughed when he saw David. David couldn't tell if Roger was laughing at him or not. He smiled. "So, David, you want to smoke?" asked Randy. "We'll stand guard." For a split second, David actually considered it. No thanks," he said. "Maybe later." He saw a look of disapproval on Scott's face. "What'd old Buttfield call you?" asked Roger. "A pimple banger?" "I don't know," David said with a shrug. "I gave her the bird," he added, trying to sound tough. "Big deal," scoffed Roger. "She probably doesn't even know what it means." Randy and Scott laughed. So did David, for lack of anything else to do. David's homeroom was a combination social studies and English class. He tried to put everything but the Gettysburg Address out of his mind as he looked it over one last time. Ricky had helped him memorize it. Ricky had been very impressed that David could memorize all those big words. But the big words were easy. It was the little words that were hard. All the 2s and 4s and A's and V's. Roger's voice suddenly popped into his head. "Big deal," he said. "She probably doesn't even know what it means." Roger had meant it as a put-down, but now, as David thought about it, it made him feel better. Maybe Mrs. Bayfield didn't know what it meant. If she didn't know what it meant, then it wasn't a bad thing for him to do. It would be no different than if he had pointed his elbow at her. He wondered how long people had been giving the finger. Maybe they'd only been doing it a few years. Who made it up, he wondered. Who decided it was a bad thing to do? And how did so many people find out about it? He wondered if his parents knew what it meant. Maybe his father, he decided, but definitely not his mother. How could she? Somebody would have had to show it to her and tell her what it meant. And he couldn't imagine that. And if his mother didn't know what it meant, then Mrs. Bayfield didn't know either. "Miss Williams," said Mr. McFarland. David felt a pang, just as if Mr. McFarland had said, "Mr. Ballinger." "Are you prepared to recite the Gettysburg Address?" asked Mr. McFarland. "Except for the hat," said Miss Williams. "I beg your pardon, nothing." A lot of kids thought Miss Williams was spacey, but David knew what she meant. She was making a joke. It was like she needed to wear a stovepipe hat in order to recite Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. She stood up. "Should I say it here, or do you want me to go to the front of the room?" "Wherever you feel most comfortable, Miss Williams," said Mr. McFarland. Miss Williams remained at her desk, standing very straight. She had long red hair, bright green eyes, and, thought David, just the right number of freckles. He didn't know how many freckles she had, but he knew it was just the right amount. He sometimes daydreamed about sitting beside her in a beautiful meadow and just counting her freckles. He was glad that Mr. McFarland had called on her, so he could stare at her without having to worry about being caught. He sat 2 rows to the left of her and 1 row back. If the classroom was a chessboard, he was a knight's move away from her. If she was a queen and he was a knight, he could take her off on his next move. She took a deep breath and began. "67 years ago, our—" "Stop," commanded Mr. McFarland. She stared bravely at the teacher. "Miss Williams, do you know what 67 years ago means?" he asked her. "No," she said very quietly. "No," he repeated. "Tell me this. How long did you take to memorize Lincoln's Gettysburg Address?" "I don't know, about an hour." "You mean to tell me you spent all that time saying the words over and over again and you don't even know what they mean? Are you a robot?" She pushed one side of her face with her tongue. She pushed out one side of her face with her tongue. "Do you own a dictionary, Miss Williams?" "Yes." "Didn't it ever occur to you to look up the words in the dictionary?" "I know what they mean separately," she said, "just not together." Mr. McFarland turned toward the rest of the class. "Will someone please tell Miss Williams what the words mean together?" Several kids raised their hands. David didn't. He knew what 67 meant, but he wasn't about to show her up. "Mr. Schwartz." Jeremy Schwartz explained that a score was 20 and that 67 equaled 87. "Thank you," said Mr. McFarland. "Now tell us, Mr. Schwartz, why did Lincoln say 87? Why didn't Lincoln just say 87? Why did he have to make it so complicated?" "Maybe that's just how people talked back then." "No, people said 87 just as they do today." He turned back to Miss Williams, who was still standing. "Miss Williams, do you think he said why do you think he said 67 instead of 87? "Because it sounds good," she said meekly. "Because it sounds good?" Mr. McFarland repeated. Several kids snickered. "What do you mean it sounds good?" "It sort of rhymes." There were more snickers. David could hardly watch. He hated to see her ridiculed in front of the whole class. "Do you mean to say," continued Mr. McFarland, "that on the site of the bloodiest battlefield in the Civil War, where there were more than 40,000 casualties, where brothers killed brothers, President Lincoln chose those words because they rhymed?" Miss Williams's face quivered. Mr. McFarland smiled. "Well, you're absolutely correct," he said. David smiled. "The Gettysburg Address is more than just a speech," Mr. McFarland told the class. "It's a piece of literature. It is a poem honoring the 40,000 young men killed or wounded. Mr. Lincoln came to that horrible sight and spoke with dignity and grace. And now, Miss Williams, I'd like you to do the same. Recite the Gettysburg Address, but don't just say the words. Feel them. Imagine you're standing on that battlefield and speak with the dignity and grace befitting the occasion." He smiled at her. "And you don't even need a hat." Miss Williams smiled sheepishly. Then, with her head held high, her green eyes flashing, she spoke. 67 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing—" David closed his eyes, leaned back in his chair, and listened to her clear, brave voice. "We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we do this." He opened his eyes and looked at her again, but for a split second, instead of Miss Williams, he saw the face of Felicia Bayfield. He toppled over in his chair. Miss Williams stopped reciting. Several kids were laughing. "Stay where you are, Mr. Ballinger," ordered Mr. McFarland. "Huh? Maybe this will teach you to sit like a human being. Please continue, Miss Williams." David felt like a bug as he lay on his back with his legs in the air while Miss Williams continued to recite. "But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground The brave men, living and dead, who David wondered if Mr. McFarland knew what it meant to give someone the finger. He wondered if President Lincoln ever flipped anyone off. That these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth. And that's the end of chapter 4.